Imagine rising from an obscure, windswept island to rule the most powerful nation in Europe. Imagine defeating coalition after coalition of the world's greatest powers, standing atop the ruins of ancient empires, and crowning yourself the master of the continent. And then, imagine losing absolutely everything. This is the story of Napoleon Bonaparte, military genius, political reformer, emperor, exile, and perhaps the most controversial figure in human history. In just over a decade, he did more than just fight wars. He reshaped the genetic makeup of Europe and, in the process, birthed the modern world. But how did he rise so fast? And why, after so much success, did he fall so dramatically? Today, in this special edition of the Mega Brain Show, we are pulling back the curtain on the man behind the legend. Our story begins in 1769 on the rugged island of Corsica. At the time, Napoleon wasn't even French. The island had only just been acquired by France from Genoa a year before his birth. He grew up speaking Italian dialects, and when he finally arrived at military school on the French mainland, he was an outsider. He was mocked for his thick accent, his short stature, and his lack of noble lineage. But Napoleon possessed something his classmates lacked: a cold, calculating intelligence and a hunger for meritocracy. He graduated from the prestigious École Militaire in Paris as a second lieutenant in artillery at the age of just 16. Artillery was the high-tech branch of the 18th century. It required math, physics, and precise timing. It was a weapon of logic, not just brawn. But while Napoleon was mastering the trajectory of cannonballs, France was about to explode into the most violent political upheaval in history. The French Revolution of 1789 shattered the old world. The king was executed, the nobility fled, and the country plunged into a chaotic reign of terror. For a young, ambitious officer with no highborn connections, this chaos was a ladder. In 1793, at the Siege of Toulon, Napoleon proved his worth. By placing his cannons with surgical precision, he forced the British fleet to flee the harbor. At 24 years old, he was promoted to brigadier general. The world was beginning to take notice. By 1796, Napoleon was given command of the French army in Italy. It was a ragtag, starving force, but Napoleon transformed them. He introduced a new kind of warfare: speed, surprise, and the maneuver sur les derrière, cutting off an enemy's line of communication. He crushed the Austrians at Lodi and Arcole, not just through firepower, but through sheer psychological dominance. He wasn't just winning battles. He was rewriting the manual on how to kill an empire. But Napoleon's eyes were on more than just Europe. In 1798, he launched a daring, almost romantic campaign in Egypt. He wanted to strike at British trade routes to India, but he also brought a small army of scientists and historians with him, eventually leading to the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. While he won the Battle of the Pyramids, his fleet was annihilated by Admiral Horatio Nelson at the Battle of the Nile. Strategically, Egypt was a trap, but politically, it was a masterstroke. Napoleon controlled the narrative, sending back glowing reports of his victories. By 1799, he sensed that the government in Paris was collapsing. He abandoned his army in Egypt, slipped past the British blockade, and staged the coup of 18 Brumaire. At 30 years old, the outsider from Corsica was now the first consul of France. The revolution had produced its ultimate dictator. In 1804, in a moment of supreme arrogance and theater, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French at Notre Dame. He famously took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head. It was a message. His power came from his own hand, not from God or the church. As emperor, he began the great work of civil reform. He implemented the Napoleonic Code, a standardized legal system that abolished feudalism and established religious freedom. Even today, the legal systems of over 40 countries are built on this foundation. He created the Bank of France, centralized the government, and established the lycées for education. He was building a modern state, but he was doing it to fuel a war machine. The years 1805 to 1807 were Napoleon's zenith. At the Battle of Austerlitz, he pulled off his greatest masterpiece, luring the superior numbers of the Russian and Austrian armies into a trap before shattering their center. He was the undisputed master of Europe, but one enemy remained: the nation of shopkeepers, Great Britain. After the disaster at the Battle of Trafalgar, Napoleon knew he couldn't invade the British Isles. Instead, he tried to starve them out with the continental system, a total economic blockade. It was this economic war that led to his fatal mistake. In 1812, Irritated by Russia's refusal to follow the blockade, Napoleon invaded with the Grande Armée, over 600,000 men. It was the largest invasion force in human history to that point. But the Russians were clever. They didn't fight. They retreated. They burned their own crops, their own villages, and eventually their own capital, Moscow. Napoleon reached Moscow only to find a city in flames. Then came the Russian winter. This was the turning point. Freezing temperatures, typhus, and constant harassment by Cossacks turned the retreat into a death march. Of the 600,000 who entered Russia, fewer than 100,000 limped back out. The invincible emperor had been broken by the snow. The end came fast. In 1813, at the Battle of Nations in Leipzig, the combined forces of Europe finally defeated him. Napoleon was forced to abdicate and was exiled to the tiny island of Elba. But the eagle would fly again. In 1815, he escaped, landed in France, and began a legendary march to Paris. The soldiers sent to arrest him instead fell to their knees in tears, joining their emperor. His final 100 days of rule culminated at the Battle of Waterloo. On a muddy field in Belgium, Napoleon faced the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian General Blücher. It was a close-run thing, but by the end of the day, the French army was in flight. Napoleon's sun had finally set. His final years were spent in a different kind of prison, the remote, windswept island of St. Helena in the middle of the South Atlantic. There, guarded by the British, the man who once ruled Europe spent his days dictating his memoirs, carefully crafting the Napoleonic legend. He died in 1821, likely of stomach cancer, at the age of 51. So, who was Napoleon Bonaparte? Was he a tyrant who sacrificed millions on the altar of his ego? Or was he the Enlightenment on horseback, a reformer who swept away the rot of the old world? Perhaps he was both. He spread the ideals of equality and meritocracy across the globe, but he did it at the point of a bayonet. He changed the map of Europe forever, and 2 centuries later, we are still living in the world he built. What do you think? Was Napoleon a hero of history or its greatest villain? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this journey through the Napoleonic era fascinating, please subscribe to the Mega Brain Show. We'll see you in the next chapter of history.